I feel as if you were to put together a list of the most forced games, the most overhyped games, the most like fake influential titles out there, you would get a lot of Western developed titles on there. You would get like Ultima, you would get like Wing Commander, you would get you know, Daggerfall or whatever, right? Nobody cares about or remembers these games. Let's be real. Like, the CRPG genre never had any relevancy. JRPGs took the concept and improved on it so quickly that the computer RPG was left in the dust and is completely obsolete outside of degenerates who only care about consuming pornography by watching their character get plowed by a bear in Baldur's Gate 3, right? You know, you have a lot of grifting, you have a lot of like industry legends that have never really produced anything before or since. The myth of the Western video game world is just a gigantic cope that exists to keep your attention away from the real innovators and the real creative leads in Japan, because nothing that the Western video game world has ever produced has ever really had any kind of real significant impact on gaming as a whole. Typically what happens is that some Westerner makes something that's extremely violent or sexual that gets hyped up by journalists for that reason. You know, Grand Theft Auto is a really good example where it's not a really well-made, interesting game. It's only popular because you can beat up NPCs and steal cars, right? Like, as an actual game, Grand Theft Auto is a complete mess and fails to live up to the legacy of much older, genuinely influential video games. You know, games that maybe a lot of Americans haven't even heard of. So with that being said, you know, that left a void to be filled. You know, Western gamers simply weren't exposed to the real innovators in the gaming space because they were all over in Japan. So the narrative in the Western gaming world was to prop up lesser developers as being innovators and major industry figures. And I don't think any video game encompasses that feeling more than Doom. So what do you do in Doom? You run around a maze and shoot things, and that's it. There's no depth, there's no creativity. You know, the level design is overly complicated. It's nowhere near the level of what N64 shooters would accomplish 5 years later with GoldenEye's mission objective structure or Turok's verticality and superior gunplay. Like, Doom is a basic FPS where you run through a bunch of monotonous, boring mazes, just shooting demons over and over again. There's no variety, there's no depth to the combat, there's no complexity, right? It is a bare bones, simplistic video game that you would probably breeze through in a weekend if you just did nothing else but play it, right? Doom is just a game that simply doesn't live up to the hype. And I've been saying this for a long time, especially when it comes to like the newer Doom games, 2016 and Eternal, which are just abominably bad. But when you play Doom and you really start thinking to yourself that, like, wow, I was playing better shooters than this on the Super Nintendo before this. When you really stop and think about that, when you start to think about how 1993 is the year we got the original Star Fox, right? When you stop and think about like what Nintendo would be doing for the first-person shooter genre in the years to come, when you think about the future of gaming and you see just how quickly Doom was replaced by slop like Halo, you really understand that this game is a product of its time. A game that is only hyped up because of the violence, because of the possibly fake religious controversy, and simply because PC gamers had never touched a real video game before. You know, like the origins of id Software come from John Carmack trying to port Super Mario Bros. 3 to PC. You know, PCs were simply not powerful enough to run the game, and so John Carmack had to harness his prodigious programming skills to get an NES game to run on PC hardware. Now, obviously, this is a complete waste of everyone's time because if you want to play Super Mario Bros. 3, you can just buy an NES. But that's the reality of PC gaming, right? They are so obsessed with this mindset of just messing around with hardware instead of actually playing games, they really lose sight of what's actually important. Actually having a game to play. And when you look at something like Doom, what you get and what you see is something that simply doesn't live up to the hype. Something that is unbearably disappointing, something that's boring and generic and uninspired, and something that simply just doesn't live up to what other superior Nintendo games have managed on superior Nintendo hardware. This is the reality of Doom. The PC Master Race's golden goose, the franchise that people have put on a pedestal for way too long. This is a game that has not really had much of an impact on anything. Much like Ultima before it, all it has going for it is that this is the first game of its kind that PC gamers were exposed to. And these people are completely unaware of the existence of the superior games on Nintendo hardware. They don't even want to know. All they care about is like running through these basic levels, pressing the shoot button over and over again, and then bragging about how hardcore the game is to their friends, right? There's no real thought into the game design or the world or any real potential for sequels. Like Doom was doomed from the onset, and it really does need to be understood that Doom faded into obscurity after Doom 2. Doom 64 was a game that nobody talked about and nobody played. Doom 3 was an incredible disappointment from everyone. And Doom 2016 is a game that's only talked about because PlayStation and Xbox owners had nothing else to play, right? It is remarkable how Doom has this audience of people who genuinely believe this to be one of the most influential video games of all time, when in reality, what exactly did it influence? You certainly don't see this kind of maze-like structure in modern FPS games. If this was influential the way that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was influential, you would be seeing those kind of influences everywhere. You would be seeing the lock-on system. You would be seeing 3D, all the elements of Zelda's 3D design, the action button, right? The sword play, the way the combat works, right? The DNA of Dark Souls is in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time's combat system, right? What does Doom do that innovates on what older FPSs managed to accomplish? All it does is having you fight demons. That's it. This game presented itself as being more edgy than other games, and as a result of it, people flock to it. It's kind of like how plebs to the fighting game world, latched on to Mortal Kombat because of the blood and the gore, without really studying, what else was out there, stuff like, King of Fighters, Street Fighter 2, the real Japanese fighting game world, which had eclipsed Mortal Kombat a long time ago. But Mortal Kombat was popular for superficial reasons. It was popular because of the digitized actors. It was popular because of the violence. It certainly wasn't because of the actual gameplay. And that is something we really do need to talk about when it comes to these kind of products, because simply being popular among a certain niche demographic doesn't make you an influential video game. What you actually need to do is leave an impact that leaves your game being played and talked about for decades to come and influencing subsequent games. People should be trying to make their games be an evolution from yours. The same way that, every platformer takes inspiration from Super Mario Bros., the same way that every third-person adventure game takes from The Legend of Zelda. Metroid has an entire genre named after it now. Like, what has Doom done? Nobody calls these kind of shooters Doom clones. They call them boomer shooters. And that's how I feel about Doom as a whole. This is a game for boomers who cannot progress past the early 90s, who were unwilling to accept the fact that Nintendo had been producing better games than this before and after, and who can't accept that Carmack and Romero never really produced any notable video game releases after this. Like all Western video game legends, they move on to something else and never really produce anything of value again, because all of them, by their very nature, are one-hit wonders that rely entirely on simply just appealing to Western sensibilities. This idea that violence is cool and that titties are awesome, and just not really making good video games. And this is not a characteristic unique to Doom. It's very present in a lot of like mediocre Western video game franchises, but I do think Doom is probably the worst example of it. Like, too many people believe this game is some like massive phenomenon when in reality it's a relatively obscure franchise that never has and never will go on to impact gaming in any meaningful way.